Hey everyone, welcome to Logan's Mosh Pit. Glad to have you here. Do me a favor and please subscribe if you haven't already. Listen up, because it's time for a new episode of Rock and Read. Today we'll pick up where we left off with Chapter 9 of No Regrets by Ace Frehley from Kiss. Let's see what happens next. We didn't become superstars overnight. People forget that sometimes. 3 albums came and went, generating only modest sales and nearly bankrupting Casablanca Records. Bill Aucoin and Neil Bogart along the way, before Kiss became the juggernaut folks recognize today. I can still remember a moment in late February 1974, not long after our first album was released, that was simultaneously one of the happiest and weirdest of my life. The music business was different back then. For better or worse, it lacked the cohesiveness and marketing power it has today. Rather than magically appearing in stores across the country with prepackaged publicity campaigns, records were often released slowly and cautiously. Audiences were allowed to build as an album gradually worked its way from the coast to the heartland, from major cities to smaller markets. Singles accompanied the release of an album, and if the proper wheels were greased, payola was alive and well in those days, whether anyone wants to admit it or not. You'd get enough airplay to create some buzz. And obviously, you went out on the road for months on end, trying to build an audience for your music. An audience that would then go out and buy your albums and generate sales of merchandise and make everyone happy and wealthy. Too bad it didn't often work out that way. We were doing things differently in Kiss, putting the cart in front of the horse, creating a brand with a unique marketing concept before we'd even developed a following. So I guess it shouldn't have been a huge surprise that the first record didn't exactly take the world by storm. Hardly anyone knew who we were, or why we were wearing this ridiculous makeup. Was the band a joke? A gimmick? No, man. We were serious. But it took some time to convince everyone else. On that February day, I walked into the now-defunct Alexander's department store on Fordham Road in the Bronx, right across the street from Fordham University. Alexander's stood near one of the busiest intersections in the borough. There was always a crowd hanging out nearby, and the traffic in and out of the place seemed never to slow. I had been shopping at Alexander's since I was little, bought a big chunk of my album collection there. So you can imagine how I felt walking through the store, my heart racing as I headed to the music section. You can imagine what it must have been like for a guy who had bought his first Hendrix record, and his first Led Zeppelin record, his first Who record, in this very spot to suddenly be thumbing through the stacks of vinyl, looking for a record of his very own. And there it was, staring out at me from a wall of new releases. Kiss. I picked it up, held it for a moment, flipped it from back to front. I smiled and laughed a little as I looked at my silver-painted face, gazing stoically from the upper right-hand corner. Then I walked to the cash register, pulled out a $10 bill, and paid for the record without saying a word. Why, you might reasonably wonder, did I have to buy my own record? Well, because Casablanca had not yet sent me a copy, or maybe our manager hadn't given me a copy. I don't even remember. I just know that when the album came out, I went to Alexander's to see it for myself and to buy my own copy. That's how slowly things worked sometimes. That's how little clout we had in those days. I didn't really feel offended by the oversight. Mainly, I was just thrilled to be walking out of the store with my own album. I wanted to take it out of the bag and shout to everyone, "Hey, look at this! I made a record!" But I didn't. There was some comfort in the anonymity, too. No one knew who I was, so even if I had shown them the album cover, they wouldn't have recognized me as the person in the upper right-hand corner. That would be one of the strangest aspects of the Kiss phenomenon. For a number of years when we went out in public, we were seen primarily, if not exclusively, in character. Life as a rock star at the highest level is weird beyond words. It's great in a lot of ways, obviously, but it's disorienting too. You very quickly begin to realize that you are part of something much bigger than yourself. Everything you do is designed to help keep the machine moving, the record sales flowing. This was especially true with Kiss, since so much of our popularity was based not merely on music, but on image. After a while, the makeup became almost like a prison. We couldn't appear anywhere out of character. If we pulled into a town and we had a radio interview scheduled, we had to get up a couple hours early to put on our makeup before going to the radio station. Think about that. Full costumes and makeup for a radio appearance, where no one would even see us. I wasn't Ace Frehley when I represented Kiss. I was the spaceman. That's just the way it worked. Again, that's not a complaint, just an observation. For a long time, the benefits of being in Kiss far outweighed the liabilities. Weird as it was to put on makeup for every public appearance, it did have the fringe benefit of allowing each of us to maintain some semblance of a private life away from the spotlight. For a little while, anyway. Not that I cared much about my privacy in those days. Like the rest of the guys in the band, I craved attention. You don't join a band and put on makeup and crazy costumes if you want people to ignore you, right? So I walked out of Alexander's and immediately began calling up my friends and Jeanette and telling them about the record. I played it in my bedroom at home, an experience so strange, listening to my very own record for the very first time, on the same turntable that spun Clapton and the Stones, that I could hardly put it into words. I sat on the edge of my bed, listening to Kiss fill the room, listening to Gene sing the words to Cold Gin, listening to my guitar solos, and I started to laugh out loud. This can't be real. But it was real. A fact made even clearer a few weeks later when I was driving around with the radio blasting, changing stations, absent-mindedly trying to find something I liked, when I heard Nothing to Lose, the first single off Kiss, pulsating through the speakers. I was so distracted that I nearly drove my car off the road. Not the first time this would happen incidentally, but after regaining my composure, I turned the volume up as far as it would go and rolled down the windows, even though it was still winter. Those are the moments you live for, the moments you dream about when you're a gangly teenager, teaching yourself chords in your bedroom, wondering if you'll ever be any good, or if you're just wasting your time. I suppose I might have been a little different from most boys. Like I said, I honestly believed I was going to be in a famous band someday, and from the moment I met Gene, Paul, and Peter, I thought Kiss would be the vehicle to make it happen. Still, there's nothing like holding your own first record album in your hands, tearing off the shrink wrap, and getting a whiff of freshly pressed vinyl. If there's anything better, it's hearing one of your songs on the radio for the very first time. It's hard to imagine any scenario in which you're closer to a group of people than you are when you're out on the road, touring with a band. That's not necessarily a good thing or a bad thing. It's just an observation. Kiss built its reputation through live performances. In the beginning especially, we were road warriors in the truest sense of the term, living out of suitcases in semi-hotels, traveling by bus, or, if we were lucky, flying coach, sleeping a few hours a night, eating at IHOP or Denny's, and almost anything that moved. One town blended into the next as we crisscrossed North America, from Asbury Park to Atlanta to Anchorage and back again. more than 100 separate shows the first year alone. We toured constantly, and when we weren't touring, we were back in the studio working on the second album. We lived together, ate together, slept together. We were four very different and unique personalities, but somehow we made it work because we were working toward a common goal. You can tolerate a lot when you're in your early 20s. Your body recovers quickly from damage inflicted by the road life. Too much to drink the night before? No big deal. You wake up, puke, down a few cups of coffee, and get on with the day. Guys in the band getting on your nerves? Just a phase. You'll get over it. While the road definitely loses its appeal with age, there's something legitimately romantic and exciting about living that nomadic life when you're young. As we became increasingly rich and famous, the quality of the accoutrements improved. Hotter chicks, 5-star hotels, and private jets. But we had no complaints about life, even on the lower rung of the rock star ladder. Groupies were there from the beginning, although it wasn't as big a deal to me as it was to some of the other guys in the band. I never had problems attracting women. I started having girlfriends when I was 12 years old. It was no great mystery to me by the time I went out on the road with Kiss. Don't get me wrong, I could with the best of them, especially when Jeanette and I were in one of our many periods of estrangement. But I didn't chase like I had never seen it before. I've heard stories about these guys who become rock stars and all of a sudden they're getting laid all the time and they basically lose their minds. I mean, I had already been with at least 50 women by the time I put on the Kiss makeup for the very first time. If you've been with only 1 or 2 women and had to beg for whatever you got off of them, it must be intoxicating to suddenly have groupies falling all over you. You go from getting laid once or twice a year to getting laid 100 times by 100 different women. It can be a little disorienting. I sort of got the feeling that Gene fell into this category. I can't say for sure because I don't know a lot about his history prior to Kiss, but I do know that once we got out on the road, Gene reacted like a starving man at a smorgasbord. I believe Gene is an addict, in much the same way that I'm an alcoholic. We all have our issues and vices, and I saw Gene's behavior affect him and the band, sometimes in a negative way. Maybe not to the extent that my drinking impacted the band, but certainly there were consequences. Gene has had a lot of unkind things to say about me over the years. Some of the criticism is legitimate. In sobriety, you embrace accountability, and I can't deny that my drinking eventually became highly disruptive and problematic. But some of the personal jabs have been harder to take, partly because we were all friends at one time, and we did do something remarkable, but also because Gene wasn't exactly the easiest guy to get along with either. Facetious, if not downright, in his professional life, Gene was an utter mess in his personal life. I guess having a love for money doesn't have anything to do with cleanliness. I should know. For the first several tours, Gene and I were roommates. Strange, considering we had so little in common. A more logical pairing would have been Paul and Gene in one room, me and Peter in the other. At first, I thought it had something to do with the fact that Peter and I were the guys who liked to party, and by splitting us up, the risk of catastrophic behavior was minimized. But that wasn't the case at all. Paul knew Gene well enough by this point to understand that he was a lousy roommate. As I quickly discovered, Gene was an epic slob. I remember the first time we were sitting in our hotel room after a show, and I looked over at Gene and saw him spitting on the floor over and over. What the are you doing, man? Throat's bothering me, he said in a raspy voice. On one hand, I felt bad for him. Gene had a problem. Whenever he did the fire breathing, which was just about every night, For hours afterward, he'd be spitting and coughing up. The kerosene really agitated his system, which was understandable. What wasn't understandable was his insistence on spitting all over the floor. I was afraid to walk to the bathroom in the middle of the night for fear of stepping in a pile of mucus. Gene, can't you at least use a garbage can or something? Whew! Another gob of phlegm, another puddle on the floor. It was disgusting, although not as unnerving as the crabs. See, Gene in those days seemed to live in a state of perpetual infestation. He would almost anything, and I think he's admitted as much. Short, tall, plump, svelte, attractive, merely tolerable. We all opened our beds to companionship on a regular basis, but somehow Gene was the one who would end up with bugs in his bush. I got creeped out just thinking about it. When you're rooming with a guy and you know he has pubic lice, well, it's a little disturbing. Every time I scratch I'd wonder whether the little bloodsuckers had crept into my bed as well, leaving me infected simply because of the proximity. Sometimes it turned out that I had been. It wasn't just the fact that I shared a room with Gene that left me vulnerable. In those days, we did everything on the fly. Stages were set up and torn down in record time. We packed lightly and traveled fast. As a consequence, our costumes were often thrown together in a single pile and packed into one suitcase, sometimes without even being washed. You can imagine how that worked out. The suitcase filled with hot, sweaty leather, crabs jumping gleefully from the demon to the star child to the cat and the spaceman. Must have been like a giant petri dish. And sure enough, within a few days, we'd all be walking around tugging at our scratching incessantly. Gene would just laugh. Occupational hazard, boys. You'll be fine. So you see, even when we weren't sharing women, which we did from time to time, we were still sharing the experience and the after effects. The thing is, when you're young and crazy, it isn't that big a deal. You go to the store, apply some ointment or medicated shampoo, and you move on. Almost nothing bothered us back then, compared to the modern-day consequences of unprotected, anonymous. Pubic lice was a relatively minor inconvenience. I remember when AIDS hit the scene in the 1980s. It was scary. Prior to that, you worried about crabs, or maybe syphilis or gonorrhea if you were really unlucky. Those things were easily dealt with. Every month or two, you'd go see the doc and get a shot of penicillin. Not necessarily because you contracted anything, but just as a precautionary measure. Given my behavior over the years, I was incredibly lucky. Never had anything more debilitating than a urinary tract infection. It could have been so much worse. The funny thing is, Gene was actually somewhat bashful when it came to his escapades. He was by nature a private man. Peter and I occasionally shared women. Paul and I too. Sometimes the three of us would share women. Later on, when there were more women than we could handle, we'd pass the chicks on to our bodyguards and the road crew. There was a pecking order, mind you. Bodyguards and roadies got leftovers, or extras. It was never the other way around. Gene rarely joined the festivities. No, for Gene. He wouldn't even shower with any of the other guys in the band. The three of us, we'd take off our makeup in the dressing room, jump in the shower room together, then get dressed in front of each other and go back to the hotel. It was like being on a baseball team or something, and this was our locker room. Not to Gene, though. He'd go off by himself, or wait until we were done. Maybe he never played team sports when he was younger. What can I tell you? Gene is eccentric. Always has been. He had a lot of idiosyncrasies. That's okay. To each his own. I just thought it was a little strange. Our first tour began in Canada in the middle of winter, and the main thing I recall is being unbelievably cold the entire time. I didn't mind, though. Here I was, almost 23 years old, and I had never even been on an airplane before, so the whole experience was new and exciting. Our first show was in Edmonton, Alberta. There was about 2 feet of snow on the ground, and yet people still came out to see us. I'm not even sure how they had any idea who we were. Maybe they were confused. Sure seemed that way sometimes. We'd hit the stage at 100 miles an hour, blowing the roof off the place, and people would just stand there for the first 20 minutes, their mouths hanging open in stunned disbelief. I couldn't even tell if they liked the music or hated it, or if they had come just because they had heard about this strange new band that wore makeup and costumes, and they just wanted to see what it was all about. The special effects on those first few tours were naturally limited by technology and resources, but we did the best we could with what we had. On one of our first trips through Canada, I decided to go out and get some smoke bombs and fireworks and try to incorporate them into the show. The physics of a Les Paul, my Gibson guitar of choice at the time, and I'm still a Gibson guy after all these years, presented some obstacles to what I wanted to accomplish. It had a back plate that was virtually airtight, meaning everything went to the channel where the wires met the pickups. I wanted smoke to come out of my guitar, real smoke, not dry ice smoke, but I realized that if I put a smoke bomb in that back chamber and lit a fuse, all the smoke would have to come out of the pickups, because that was the only canal through which it could travel. So in the middle of a show, right before one of my solos, I picked up a cigarette lighter and lit the fuse. It looked alright, and the crowd seemed to get into it, but I wanted more smoke. Unfortunately, I soon discovered that while the smoke didn't necessarily affect my playing, it did affect the equipment, screwing up tone and volume controls. So the whole concept went out the window for a while, until I could get together with an engineer and come up with a more practical design. The most important thing was that we played with conviction, regardless of whether we were headlining or opening for another act, and we came across as being a serious band, a powerful, exciting, visual band. People got caught up in that. Usually by the end of the show, or even halfway through, as the special effects, the flash pots, the fog, the fire, and the smoke bombs kicked in, people would get completely wrapped up in the show, and we'd win the audience over. Even the folks who started off being skeptical would invariably be applauding and calling for encores, asking for more. They might not have known what they had just seen, but they sure as wanted to see more of it. Critics were less easily impressed. We got ripped in the New York Times, ripped in Rolling Stone, ripped in Cream. Serious rock journalists seemed incapable of looking past the makeup and costumes and objectively reviewing our performances or recordings. Or maybe they just hated everything about us. I don't know. But the negative reviews seemed mainly to fuel curiosity and controversy. Some critics were less spiteful, offering grudging respect for our musicianship and writing, and especially for the energy we brought to our shows. Mainly, though, it was word of mouth that proved most beneficial for KISS. We built a fan base the old-fashioned way, by getting out and playing night after night, in town after town, encouraging legions of fans to join what would come to be known as the KISS Army. The most interesting moments occurred when KISS tried to enter the realm of stodgy, mainstream entertainment. Bill Aucoin and Neil Bogart weren't about to leave any opportunity for publicity unexploited, so while KISS might have been seen by some as a hard rock band, bordering on metal, whose members were into weird, evil imagery or sadomasochistic fetishism, neither true, of course, our management craved exposure to a more diverse audience. In short, they wanted KISS to be seen and heard by everyone, from teenagers in New Jersey to housewives in the Midwest. So we taped 3 songs during a performance on Dick Clark's In Concert, which was one of the few places on network television. Cable was little more than a blip on the radar at the time, where a band could be seen and heard. We taped the show in late February, performing Firehouse, Black Diamond, and Nothing to Lose, and it aired by the end of March. Dick Clark was terrific, as smart and gracious as I expected him to be. I had grown up watching American Bandstand and always thought Dick Clark was not just an astute businessman, but a real music fan as well. He treated us professionally, without a hint of condescension or bemusement. In return, we performed live, and with our customary fury. This wasn't a small thing. Most bands who appeared on television shows in the 70s opted for the safety of recorded music and lip-syncing. Not Kiss. Same thing when we went on NBC's The Midnight Special. Kiss was a live band, a spectacle. There was no point in faking it. Kiss was just trying to be Kiss, with each of us staying in character, regardless of the circumstances or venue. Could lead to moments of unintended hilarity and genuine what the cluelessness. Like the time we appeared on the Mike Douglas Show in April 1974. Now, I'll say for the record that I always kind of liked Mike Douglas. Like Dick Clark, he was a Philadelphia guy, seemingly too polite and well-mannered for the town that made him famous. A bit of a square, too, but that was okay. I had grown up watching American Bandstand on weekends and the Mike Douglas Show on weekday afternoons. It was a plain, vanilla TV talk show, weirdly comforting in its blandness. You could always count on Mike to smile his way through a show, regardless of the guest, and to perform a song or two in his own little lounge act sort of way. He seemed like a legitimately nice guy, and I don't think it was just an act. Still, it was a bizarre decision for Kiss to use the Mike Douglas Show as the forum for its first live interview on national television. But as always, there was a method to the madness, and it sprang mainly from the dementedly fertile mind of Neil Bogart. Neil heard about a promotional contest hatched by a pair of Florida disc jockeys to use our band's name as a hook for a kissing contest promoted by their radio station. This was the sort of nonsense that could help a band in its infancy. Too much of it, though, could destroy a band's reputation. Kiss always walked the fine line between parody and promotion. It was easy to lose your soul if you did too much of this sort of thing, and God knows there was no shortage of people who wanted to exploit the fanaticism of Kiss fans. In this case, the idiocy began with what appeared to be a fairly benign kissing contest. But Neil took the concept nationwide and even suggested the Kiss do a cover of the old Bobby Rydell song, Kissin' Time, as a way to help promote the contest. If ever there was a moment when the guys in the band were united in their opinion of Neil, this was it. We owed the guy just about everything, sure, but a cover version of Kissin' Time, the sugary little teeny bopper tune from the late 1950s, it was spectacularly inappropriate, completely nuts, and we all knew it. Kiss covering Kissin' Time made no sense at all. It made a mockery of everything we were trying to do. We were supposed to be loud, edgy, dangerous. Why would we try to be a bubblegum band? Because it's brilliant, Neil argued. People will love it. There was a twisted logic to the promotion, and I suppose in the end it had precisely the impact Neil wanted, which was to get people talking about Kiss and to create more opportunities for exposure. It was never about the music with Neil. It was about the show. It was about making money and expanding the brand. But at what cost? We all wanted fame and adulation, but in the weeks that we rewrote and recorded Kissin' Time, none of us felt very good about what we were doing. This was the first time I felt like choosing style over substance had unintended and seriously unpleasant consequences. And I think all the guys, even Gene, who never met a promotional opportunity he couldn't wrap his tongue around, felt the same way. But Neil was the boss. He owned Casablanca Records. He could pull the plug any time he wanted. He could cut our touring and recording budgets. He was the ringmaster, and we were part of the circus. The show must go on, right? Kissin' Time was recorded as a single and added to the first album when it was reissued a few months after initial release. We all hated the song, much more than we hated the contest promotion, actually. The contest was stupid, but harmless. The song damaged our reputation. Anyway, it was the contest that brought us to Philadelphia and the Mike Douglas Show, where we'd perform live. We did Firehouse, not Kissin' Time, but only after Gene had been invited to chat with Mike and his panel, which included comedians Toady Fields and Robert Klein for a few minutes, just prior to introducing the winners of the National Kissing Contest. Serving as the unofficial face of Kiss, Gene sauntered out onto the stage in character, while the rest of us watched on closed-circuit television backstage. "We have a new rock group for you, Toady," Mike had said just before holding up a copy of Kiss. "But before we see them perform, I want you to meet one of the members of this act, close up." As the boys and I howled with laughter backstage, and the crowd reacted with disbelief, Gene took a seat between Mike and Toady. "Mind if I spread my wings?" he asked, unfurling his spindly frame, made even longer thanks to 8-inch platform shoes, and exposing the bat-like torso of his costume. Mike played along good-naturedly, but when Gene described himself as evil incarnate, Toady Fields cast him a look that at first seemed to betray disgust or revulsion, but was quickly revealed to be merely annoyance. Hey, Gene was just doing his stick. He was being the demon or whatever the he thought he was. If it had been me, and I was supposed to stay in character, I would have walked out there and cackled stupidly and said, "Hey, Mike, I'm the spaceman. Nice to meet you." None of it was real or to be taken seriously. It was supposed to be fun, and I thought Gene did a great job with it. But as the interview went on and the repartee grew sharper, I couldn't help but be thankful that I hadn't been asked to do the job. Wouldn't it be funny if under this he was just a nice Jewish boy? An exasperated Toady said at one point. The crowd roared as Gene smiled coyly. "You should only know," he said with a chuckle. It was intended as an inside joke. Gene, of course, was 100% Jewish, having been born in Israel under the name Chaim Witz. I doubt Toady Fields knew anything about Gene's background, but she didn't miss a beat. Toady, after all, was a professional comedian, and Gene was no match for her when it came to trading one-liners. "I do," she shot back. "You can't hide the hook." Gene furrowed his brow and snarled half-heartedly. He was smart enough to know when he had been beaten. The interview then turned to the subject of the National Kissing Contest, and the winners were brought out on stage. Gene stood and wrapped them both in his bat wings, and a few minutes later we all came out and performed Firehouse. The whole thing came off fairly well, I thought, and we got good reviews for the show. Believe it or not, some people didn't know how seriously to take Gene. It was brilliant that way, even if it wasn't necessarily intentional. It allowed Kiss to maintain the element of danger that was such an important part of our early persona and our early success. It wasn't all an act. Although not exactly evil incarnate, we were threatening. Our fan base was composed largely of adolescent boys and young men, and what parent wants them listening to hard rock by a band that looks like it just stepped off the set of a horror movie? We looked dangerous, and at times we behaved recklessly and hedonistically. We didn't try to hide any of that. Well, most of the time anyway. In August 1974, we paused in the middle of a tour and relocated to Los Angeles to work on the second Kiss album, Hotter Than Hell. As with the first record, it was an intense experience. 3 weeks of 10-hour days at Village Recorders, again with Richie Wise and Kenny Kerner producing. We were all tired and starting to feel some pressure from Casablanca, as the first record hadn't exactly been a big hit. Yeah, it had sold around 75,000 copies, but that hadn't even been enough to cover the band's expenses. We hoped to do better with Hotter Than Hell, but everything was happening so fast that it was becoming hard to tell whether we were even on the right track. Using songs left over from the demo and the material we'd written on the road, we assembled the record at breakneck speed. My contributions were much more significant than on the first record. I co-wrote Coming Home with Paul, and also wrote Parasite and Strange Ways, a song that remains one of my favorites, even though Kiss never performed it in concert. I wish now that I'd had the guts to sing Strange Ways on that record. It's an emotionally demanding song, heavy and rhythmic, with a great guitar solo at its center. It was all mine, and I should have claimed it as such for the record, but I had no confidence in my own vocal ability, especially around Paul and Gene and Peter, who thrived in the spotlight and had a way of pushing through a song, any song, regardless of any vocal limitations. Great singers are talented, sure, but they also have passion, and they're usually arrogant as well. You can't get up there and sing if you don't believe in yourself. I knew I was a good guitar player. I had no idea whether I could sing at all, so for the longest time, I didn't even try. Parasite I offered to Gene, because it seemed to suit him, and he liked it. Rather than give Strange Ways to Paul or Gene, though, I offered it to Peter. As the drummer, he was the least visible member of Kiss, elevating drum riser notwithstanding, so his ego was perpetually bruised anyway. I thought having a vocal track on the record would make him feel less threatened. Besides, I liked Peter's voice and thought it was right for the song. Although basically we recorded the album live, the Hotter Than Hell sessions lacked the spontaneity and thrill that we experienced while making Kiss. That's not surprising. There's nothing quite like the first record, when everything is new and exciting. Making Hotter Than Hell felt more like a job, a responsibility. It didn't help matters any that we were fish out of water, 4 New Yorkers in LA, sequestered on the West Coast for the better part of a month. We had already been on the road for months and wanted nothing more than to get back home. But Neil wanted us closer to the Casablanca offices so he could keep an eye on things. In my case, the plan backfired. I can look back now and say that my drinking began to escalate during the making of Hotter Than Hell, partly as a response to the pressure, and partly because I didn't want to be in LA. Those are just excuses, and I offer them not because I want sympathy, but simply as a point of illumination. Drinking was my crutch. It had been since I was a teen, and it remained that way through my time in Kiss, only with more profound consequences. On the night before we were supposed to do a photo shoot for Hotter Than Hell, I got into one of my first serious car accidents. Now, I have a reputation for being one of the world's worst drivers, but that's not entirely well deserved. I'm actually a pretty good driver. I'm just a really bad drunk driver. I've totaled a lot of cars over the years, but I've never had so much as a fender bender while sober. Trouble is, from roughly the mid-1970s to the mid-2000s, whenever I got behind the wheel of a car, the odds were pretty good that I'd been drinking. This was one of those times. We were staying at the Ramada Inn on Sunset Boulevard, basically just hanging out and partying whenever we weren't at the studio. I've tried over the years to remember exactly why I left the hotel that particular night and climbed into the front seat of my rented Chevy. But that's the thing about being a 40-year drinker. It takes its toll on your memory, leaving some recollections strikingly vivid and others filled with holes. I knew I was pissed off about something, probably something stupid, because I remember feeling angry as I cruised through the Hollywood Hills, accelerating through turns like I was a Formula One driver. I found this one particular street in the hills challenging, so like an idiot I kept circling around these twists and turns over and over again, trying to navigate the course a little faster each time. Must have made it around the loop at least 5 or 6 times. The next thing I knew, my car was spinning out of control and a telephone pole was coming up fast, rising to meet the windshield. The car spun sideways at the last minute, just enough to avoid a head-on collision, but the impact was still severe enough that I was catapulted forward into the windshield. As the dust settled on the shoulder of the highway, I started to laugh, a natural byproduct of being drunk and relieved to be alive. At first, I was pretty sure I hadn't even been seriously hurt at all, until I felt something warm trickling down my face. I put a hand to my cheek and wiped away the blood, but the flow continued. I glanced at the rearview mirror, only to discover that it had been shattered, probably after getting rammed by my head. The car wasn't completely totaled, but neither was it functional. Luckily, the accident had occurred not far from the Ramada, so I got out of the car and began to walk. I can only imagine what I must have looked like, lurching along the side of the road, long hair matted and blood running down my face. I still don't have any idea what happened to the car. I just left it there. Presumably the cops came by, traced the registration, and contacted someone in the band. I don't remember any legal ramifications, but there was blowback for sure. When I arrived at the hotel, I went straight to our road manager's room. He was a big guy named Junior, adept at everything from managing schedules to fighting with shady promoters. Not much scared Junior, but when he threw open the door and saw me standing there, his eyes widened. "Ace? What the happened to you?" "Doesn't matter," I said, "but I think we need to go to the hospital." Encrusted in blood and dirt, with a substantial gash on my forehead that was beginning to swell up, I probably looked like I was more seriously injured than I really was. I felt like, though. Anyway, they cleaned me up at the ER, gave me some stitches, painkillers, and antibiotics, and sent me on my way, with one stern order: no makeup allowed. If anything gets in that cut, it's liable to get infected, the doctor explained. Trust me, you don't want that. No, I didn't want that at all. As luck would have it, though, I was supposed to be wearing my makeup the next day for a photo shoot to supplement the new album. I did as instructed and showed up with makeup on only one side of my face, which is why all the photos from that session only show my profile. As we were shooting, the other guys in the band alternately expressed their concern for my health and shook their heads in disbelief, as if to say, "Ace, man, what's next?" Well, that's the end of Chapter 9. Let me know what you thought of this chapter in the comments below. That does it for today's video, guys. I hope you enjoyed. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. I really appreciate the support. I'll see you next time. Till then, rock on.